The orbital station hung like a lone sentinel in the void, a cold, steel construct drifting in the silent embrace of space. Below, a blue-green planet shimmered against the black, indifferent to the lives unraveling above it. Inside the station's grand atrium, diplomats, traders, and soldiers from various factions moved in orchestrated chaos, their voices blending into a steady hum. Sarah Carter stood among them, her sharp eyes scanning the room while she clutched a data pad against her chest. A diplomat's assistant in title, her true role was more nuanced: liaison, strategist, and, when necessary, a voice of reason between human factions and the Galactic Empire. She had spent the past few months navigating delicate negotiations, attempting to temper the Empire's ever-growing hunger for control. But even as she moved with quiet confidence, she knew she was an outsider in their world, a tolerated presence rather than a respected one. The moment the Empire's soldiers arrived, she sensed the shift in atmosphere before the first shout rang out. A squad of black-armored enforcers swept into the hall with military precision, their weapons primed and expressions unreadable behind their helmets. Conversations died. Some of the station's inhabitants, those who had dealt with the Empire before, stepped back, pressing against walls, knowing better than to interfere. Sarah remained still as one of the soldiers scanned the room, his gaze locking onto her with unnerving speed. "Sarah Carter," he called, his voice filtered through the modulator of his helmet. "By order of the Galactic Empire, you are to be taken into custody immediately." She didn't move, didn't flinch. A slow exhale left her lips as she straightened. "On what charges?" The soldier took a step closer. "You are classified as a security risk." A vague, convenient accusation. Sarah knew better than to expect transparency from the Empire. Still, she held her ground. "I'm here on a diplomatic mission. Detaining me would be a violation of the station's neutrality agreement." The enforcer showed no sign of concern. That agreement was revoked 2 hours ago. That meant this had been in motion long before they arrived. Her stomach tightened. Behind her, a few bystanders murmured in protest, but no one dared step forward. The Empire had made a spectacle of silencing those who resisted. She glanced at the datapad in her hand, considering the encrypted message waiting within, one she had intended to send before she left. A message that could now remain unread. She met the soldier's gaze, her voice measured. "I'll come willingly. No need for theatrics." "Drop the datapad," he ordered. Sarah hesitated. If she refused, they'd take it by force, and she had no doubt their methods would be less than gentle. She let it slip from her fingers, watching as it clattered onto the polished floor. A second later, a soldier crushed it under his boot, shattering the device. She clenched her jaw but said nothing. 2 enforcers stepped forward, binding her wrists in restraints before leading her through the station. Eyes followed her, but no one spoke. No one acted. The Empire's grip on the sector was too strong, and fear was a potent weapon. They moved swiftly through the docking bay, where a sleek Imperial shuttle awaited. As they reached the boarding ramp, she finally allowed herself a single glance upward, toward the stars beyond the station's glass dome. She didn't need to see Earth to know where it was. More importantly, she knew who was there. If they had any idea who her husband was, they never would have taken her. Jack Carter wasn't an easy man to find, but then again, most people weren't looking for him. Deep within the rugged expanse of an uncharted planet, he lay prone against the dirt, his rifle steady against his shoulder. A kilometer away, a set of rusted metal gates creaked as 2 figures argued beneath the midday sun. Jack adjusted his scope, slowing his breathing. The target, a former arms dealer turned warlord, was gesturing wildly, his back to the worn-down building behind him. The second figure, a local guide who had unknowingly walked into the lion's den, looked nervous. Jack exhaled. The trigger pulled back smoothly. The warlord never finished his sentence. The guide bolted, disappearing into the surrounding trees. Jack didn't wait to see if he made it. He was already moving, disassembling his rifle in a practiced motion as he retreated through the underbrush. He had no allegiance to the factions at war here, no interest in their struggles. He only took contracts that served a purpose, ones that kept the balance of power from tipping too far in the wrong direction. As he reached his ship, a small notification blinked on his comm unit. A message, marked urgent. He frowned. There were only a handful of people who had access to this channel. The moment he opened it, the world around him fell away. "We have your wife. Surrender, or she dies." There was no signature, no identifying markers, but it didn't matter. Jack had spent his life hunting men who thought themselves untouchable. He knew how to track ghosts. And now, he had every reason to become one himself. The moon loomed ahead, a barren, cratered husk suspended in the void. Prison Outpost K-47 sat embedded within its surface like a malignant growth, a fortress of black metal and reinforced shielding. It was a place where prisoners vanished, where names were erased from records, and where the Empire's worst secrets were buried beneath layers of steel and silence. Few who entered ever saw the stars again. Jack Carter studied the facility from the cockpit of the Reaper, his stolen stealth ship running cold in the shadows of a passing asteroid. His fingers hovered over the controls, his mind calculating the countless ways this could go wrong. He had seen high-security installations before, had infiltrated enemy strongholds in war zones that barely made the history books, but this was different. This wasn't about a mission. This wasn't about orders. This was about Sarah. He tapped into the ship sensors, analyzing the layout Marcus had provided. The outpost's defenses were as formidable as expected. Patrolling sentry drones, turrets capable of vaporizing anything larger than a fighter, and a full platoon of elite enforcers stationed at the entrance. No conventional assault would work. He didn't have an army at his back. He had his skill, his instincts, and the element of surprise. That would have to be enough. A notification blinked on his display. Marcus had sent a final encrypted message before cutting the signal to prevent detection. Blind spot located. West Docking Bay, maintenance shaft. Limited window. Get in fast. Jack exhaled slowly. No hesitation. No second thoughts. He adjusted the Reaper's trajectory, angling toward the moon's dark side, where the station's external sensors were weakest. With precise timing, he killed the main thrusters, allowing momentum to carry him forward. The ship drifted, silent as death, slipping beneath the outpost's perimeter scans. At the last second, he fired the maneuvering thrusters, guiding the ship toward a maintenance hatch. The hull groaned as the landing clamps latched onto the station's surface. A perfect approach. No alarms. No response. Jack secured his helmet, disengaged the cockpit locks, and stepped into the airlock. As the pressurization sequence completed, he drew his suppressed sidearm, its familiar weight steadying his breath. The hatch opened into darkness. He moved swiftly through the narrow maintenance tunnel, boots barely making a sound against the grated flooring. The air smelled of machine oil and old metal, the hum of the station's power core vibrating beneath his feet. He had studied the layout meticulously. 2 turns left, a vertical shaft, then a crawlspace leading to the lower detention levels. If Marcus's intel was solid, he could reach Sarah within 20 minutes. If not, he'd improvise. A faint mechanical whirring echoed ahead. Jack pressed against the wall, watching as a sentry drone drifted past, scanning for anomalies. He timed his movement, slipping through its blind spot just as it rounded a corner. Every step, every breath, was calculated. He couldn't afford a single mistake. After scaling the vertical shaft, he dropped into the ventilation crawlspace, his muscles tensing at the sound of approaching footsteps below. Peering through the grates, he spotted 2 enforcers patrolling the corridor beneath him, their rifles held at ease. "Can't believe they're keeping her here," one muttered. "She must be important," the other replied. Why else would the higher-ups send a fleet escort for her transport tomorrow? Jack's jaw tightened. He hadn't known about the transport. If Sarah was moved off-world, she'd disappear into the Empire's core systems, beyond his reach. He had to act now. The patrol passed. Jack loosened the grate and slipped down, landing soundlessly. He moved quickly, hugging the shadows until he reached a security console. A few keystrokes confirmed what he needed. Sarah was being held in Block C, Cell 17. 2 floors down. The quickest route required passing through the central checkpoint. Too risky. But there was another way. A uniformed officer exited a side door, heading toward the supply room. Jack followed. The moment the door slid shut behind them, he struck. A swift blow to the base of the skull, and the officer crumpled. Jack stripped him of his keycard and uniform, adjusting the fit before slipping the helmet over his head. He grabbed the officer's datapad for good measure. The disguise wasn't perfect, but it would buy him time. With measured strides, he walked back into the hallway, blending seamlessly with the station's personnel. No one spared him more than a glance. The datapad in his hand became his shield, an excuse to be anywhere, a silent assertion of belonging. He reached the secured wing of Block C. 2 guards flanked the entrance, their stances rigid, their rifles charged. Jack barely slowed his pace as he approached, raising the datapad. "Prisoner transfer," he said, his voice even. "Orders just came through." The taller guard frowned. "Didn't hear anything about a transfer." Jack exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if irritated. "Because command just changed the timeline. You think they care about updating you?" He made a show of tapping the datapad, then handed it over. "Check it yourself." The guard took the device, scrolling through the fabricated data Marcus had injected into the system. His suspicion wavered. Jack waited. A beep confirmed the clearance code. The guard muttered a curse and pressed the panel behind him. The doors unlocked with a hiss. "Whatever. She's your problem now," the guard grumbled. Jack stepped inside. The cell was small, dimly lit by a single overhead panel. Sarah sat on the cot, her back straight, her wrists bound by energy restraints. Despite the bruises along her jaw, her gaze was steady. She didn't flinch when he entered. She didn't call out. She simply tilted her head, eyes narrowing beneath the dim light. Jack removed his helmet. For the briefest moment, her breath caught. Then she exhaled, and something in her posture shifted. The tension that had gripped her since the moment she was taken melted away. "Took you long enough," she murmured. Jack smirked. Traffic was hell. She smiled, but it was short-lived. "We need to move. They're transferring me off-world in a few hours." "Not happening." Jack stepped forward, disabling the restraints with a quick flick of the stolen keycard. "Can you walk?" Sarah flexed her fingers, wincing slightly but nodding. "I've had worse." Jack turned toward the door. "Stay close." Then the alarms blared. Red emergency lights flared to life, bathing the corridor in pulsing crimson. Klaxons screamed through the prison outpost, a shrill warning that the facility had been breached. Jack didn't waste time cursing the alarm. He already knew what had gone wrong. His fabricated clearance code had been good enough to get him in, but not good enough to fool the deeper security protocols. The system had caught the inconsistency, and now the entire base was on high alert. Sarah was already moving, slipping in beside him as they stepped out of the cell. She rolled her shoulders, shaking off the stiffness from confinement. "You came all this way," she muttered. "Might as well make it worth the trip." Jack smirked, but his mind was already 3 steps ahead, mapping their exit. The way he had come in was compromised. No doubt the docking bay was already locked down. That meant they needed another way out. The security console in the hall would have the outpost schematics. He moved fast, overriding the access panel with the stolen keycard. Lines of data scrolled across the screen. The ventilation shafts were too narrow to maneuver quickly. The service tunnels had already been sealed. That left only one real option: the central hangar. He studied the guard positions displayed on the screen. Heavy patrols, a choke point at the entrance, and worst of all, a containment barrier blocking any unauthorized departures. "Marcus," Jack muttered into his comm, knowing the hacker would be listening from his hidden relay. "We need that barrier down." Static crackled in his ear before Marcus's voice came through, tight with urgency. "I'm on it, but I need time. Empire security is layered like a damn onion." Jack turned to Sarah, who was already rifling through the unconscious guard's holster. She pulled out a sleek, compact sidearm, checked the charge, then met his gaze. "Let's make some noise," she said. Jack grinned, then they moved. Footsteps pounded from the far end of the corridor. Jack pressed against the wall as 2 guards rounded the corner. Before they could react, he fired twice, both shots precise, center mass. The guards crumpled, their weapons clattering to the floor. Sarah didn't hesitate. She scooped up one of the fallen rifles and took point, her movements sharp and practiced. Together, they navigated the maze of sterile hallways, heading toward the upper levels where the hangar was located. The compound shook as an explosion detonated in the distance. Marcus must have triggered a diversion in the lower levels, rerouting some of the patrols. Jack and Sarah reached the main stairwell. As they ascended, a squad of enforcers cut them off, rifles raised. No words were exchanged, just the sharp bark of plasma fire. Jack dove behind a bulkhead as bolts of energy scorched the walls. He leaned out, took quick aim, and dropped the first soldier with a clean shot to the visor. Sarah moved with him, firing in controlled bursts, her shots precise. One enforcer collapsed, another stumbled, and within seconds, the hallway was clear. Jack exhaled and reloaded. "You still got it." Sarah wiped a trickle of sweat from her brow. "You expected anything less?" They pushed forward, reaching the final corridor before the hangar bay. A reinforced blast door blocked their path, its access panel flashing red. Jack moved to override it, but before he could, a new voice rang out from the comm system above them. "Jack Carter." He froze. The voice was cold, sharp, a blade honed over decades of command. He knew that voice. Commander Varos. Jack's hands tightened into fists as the comm continued. "Did you really think you could walk into my station, take what's mine, and leave unscathed? You are outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded." A pause. "Surrender now, and I may consider showing mercy." Jack glanced at Sarah, saw the fire in her eyes. He turned his gaze to the blast door. There was no going back. He raised his weapon, aimed at the control panel, and fired. Sparks showered from the ruined console. The door hissed, then groaned as the locks disengaged. "Surrender," Jack muttered. "Not today." The door slid open, revealing the vast hangar bay. Inside, rows of Imperial shuttles and fighter craft gleamed under the harsh white lights. Docking crews scrambled as security forces rushed toward them. The energy barrier still shimmered at the far end, sealing off their escape route. Sarah sprinted ahead, weaving between crates and equipment as Jack provided covering fire. He took out a sentry turret before it could lock onto them, then ducked as a fighter's engines roared to life. "Marcus!" Jack barked into the comm. "I'm working on it." Marcus shouted back. "Almost." The containment barrier flickered. Then, in a burst of static, it failed. Jack didn't waste a second. He spotted a sleek two-person transport docked near the edge of the hangar, its engines prepped for launch. He and Sarah sprinted toward it, plasma fire cutting through the air behind them. A figure stepped into their path, an officer, pistol raised. Before he could fire, Sarah lunged, striking hard and fast. The officer staggered, and in one fluid motion, she grabbed his weapon, turned it on him, and fired. He dropped without a sound. They reached the transport. Jack slammed his palm against the access panel, and the hatch hissed open. They dove inside, Sarah taking the co-pilot's seat as Jack activated the launch sequence. A warning flashed on the display. Docking clamps engaged. Manual override required. Cursing, Jack turned to Sarah. "I need 30 seconds. "Buy yourself 20, she said, already raising the ship's cannons. Jack bolted out of the cockpit, weaving between shots as he reached the exterior panel. He wrenched it open and manually bypassed the docking locks. The clamps groaned, then released. Back inside, Sarah fired the ship's thrusters, sending a shockwave across the hangar. Jack barely strapped in before they shot forward. Alarms blared. Fighters scrambled to intercept. Jack pushed the throttle to max. The ship rocketed through the hangar's exit, slipping past the pursuing craft. Explosions erupted behind them as the docking bay imploded, Marcus's final parting gift. They had made it. For now. The stars stretched into streaks of white as the stolen transport tore through hyperspace. Jack kept his hands steady on the controls, eyes flicking between the ship's readouts and the sensor display. No pursuit yet, but it wouldn't last. The Empire didn't take humiliation lightly, and breaking into one of their black site prisons to steal back a high-value detainee was more than a minor offense. It was an act of war. Sarah sat beside him, quietly securing her injuries with the limited medkit supplies. Her movements were quick, practiced. She had spent years tending to wounds like these, in places just as hostile. Jack could see the tension in her posture, the weight of captivity still clinging to her. He knew the feeling well. "We're not out of this yet," he said. She exhaled. "I know." Jack ran a quick diagnostic. The ship was fast, but not built for combat. They needed a plan before the inevitable chase began. He activated the comm and patched through to Marcus. "We're clear, but not for long." The hacker's voice crackled in response. "Yeah, about that. You really pissed them off." A pause. "They're scrambling a fleet." Jack's jaw tightened. "How long?" "Minutes. You burned one of their most secure facilities to the ground. That's not something they'll let slide." Sarah leaned forward. "Can you get us a safe port?" Marcus hesitated. "Not immediately. But I can give you something better. Coordinates for an old weapons cache. Unregistered ship, enough firepower to even the odds." Jack exchanged a glance with Sarah. She gave a slight nod. "Send it." A second later, new coordinates blinked onto the screen. Jack adjusted course. Silence settled over the cockpit as they prepared for what came next. Sarah broke it first. "This doesn't end with us running, does it?" Jack shook his head. No. They had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The Empire had taken Sarah because they thought no one would come for her. They had believed they could get away with it. That mistake would cost them. Minutes later, they emerged from hyperspace above a dead moon, its surface scarred from ancient battles. At its core, a hidden base lay dormant, long abandoned but still functional. Jack guided the transport down, kicking up clouds of dust as they landed. The entrance was sealed, but a quick override from Marcus remotely powered up the systems. The doors groaned open, revealing an arsenal left untouched by time. Fighters, heavy assault weapons, explosives, everything they needed to send a message. Jack stepped out of the cockpit, surveying their newfound armory. Sarah stood beside him, her gaze sharp. "What's the plan?" Jack picked up a rifle, testing its weight. "We don't wait for them to come to us." They had spent their lives in the shadows, striking only when necessary. But this time, it was different. This time, they weren't just surviving. This time, they were at war.